apart from he is the best mentor for most of staff in our school, he makes a huge contribution to color science society. So Steve originally worked for the color chemistry, then the color physics and color imaging, color vision, color design, and color AI. So basically everything he worked all make great contribution to color science society. And today he's going to talk about something related to color in well-being. Okay, Steve, I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kauda, and thank you everyone for attending today. Let's go to the start of that at the end. As Kauda suggested there, we're interested in our group in quite a lot of different aspects of colour. But one of the things that we're really interested in is the effect of light on people. And today I'm going to talk about, very briefly, research from 4 or 5 projects that are all connected in that way. And I'll also make some speculations about what it all might mean at the end. So first of all, is blue relaxing? I think many people do find blue relaxing and may find this scene relaxing. Of course, if you were there and you had the sounds and the smell and the wind on your face, as I will be next week when I go to Tenerife, then it would be even more relaxing. Colour is only one aspect of our sensory experience, of course. But nevertheless, people do tend to find blue relaxing. And I'm going to suggest that that's likely a psychological effect caused by association. So we associate the colour blue with things that we find pleasant or relaxing. But I'm going to explain that it's likely a lot more complicated than that. And that's what this talk is really about. It's about why colours affect us in certain ways. So the first thing I want to say is that perhaps everybody attending this presentation knows that the human visual system has 3 types of cone, light-sensitive cells in the retina, long, medium, and short wavelength sensitive cones, which are responsible for our colour vision, and you can see their spectral sensitivities on this diagram, along with the rods, which are responsible for sort of night vision. But only about 20 years ago, it was discovered that there was a 5th photoreceptor in the human visual system, and we call it intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, which is a bit of a mouthful. Most people say IPRGC. And these cells exist in a different part of the retina to the rods and the cones, and they send their outputs to a different part of the brain than the rods and the cones do. But notice that their peak sensitivity is in the blue-green region, so around about 480 nanometers. So I mentioned they're in a different part of the retina. This is a diagram of the retina. You see the rods and the cones at the top here. Light is coming, in this case, from the bottom. And information from the rods and the cones activates these other cells, bipolar cells, the ganglion cells, for example, before going to the brain. And for decades, we assumed all the photosensitive material in the eye was in this layer of the retina. But about 20 years ago, we discovered that a small number of these ganglion cells actually contain their own photopigment. And that's why we say they're intrinsically photosensitive, because you could argue they're photosensitive indirectly from the responses from the rods and the cones, or the outputs of the rods and the cones. But a small number of these retinal ganglion cells have their own photopigment in. They're intrinsically photosensitive. And this was discovered, I say, only about 20 years ago. So most people know that the ear performs 2 functions. One is hearing, and the other one is balance. People know less well that the eye also performs 2 important functions. So the first function is the one we all know about. We call it image forming, vision, the fact that we can see. But the second function, we call it non-image forming. Basically, it's got nothing to do with vision and everything to do with these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. Because what happens is these cells, whereas the cones send their output eventually to the back of the brain, an area called the visual cortex, where perhaps we can say that vision takes place. These retinal ganglion cells send their input to the middle of the brain, part of the brain called the hypothalamus. And what's interesting about that is the hypothalamus of the brain controls lots of physiological functions. For example, we know that the body has a so-called circadian rhythm, an approximately 24-hour cycle of waking and sleeping. So you can see at the top right here, if you take, for example, melatonin, you can see that round about 7 o'clock tonight, your body will start, well, if you're living in the UK, that is, your body will start producing melatonin, which will reach a peak about 2 o'clock in the morning and then will reduce. Meanwhile, as it reduces, your body starts producing cortisol, reaching a peak around about 8 o'clock in the morning. These hormones control our alertness and our sleep patterns. And we now know that activation of the hypothalamus by light via these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells basically keeps this in check. It entrains this approximately 24-hour cycle. So it regulates the circadian rhythm, helps us get sufficient sleep. And what's interesting is that poor and or insufficient sleep is now associated with a much higher risk of a number of unfortunate health conditions. So poor sleep is associated with increased risk of diabetes, obesity, and heart disease. And melatonin, which is the hormone produced whilst we're sleeping, is thought to be a cancer suppressant. Because of this, there's been a lot of interest in the last decade about blue light. Why blue light? Because remember, I showed you the spectral sensitivity. These retinal ganglion cells are mainly sensitive to blue light. So what normally happens is in nature, they would not be receiving any activation in the evening, because before we had artificial light, there was just firelight or candles, and that doesn't contain hardly any blue light at all. The introduction of electric light, and particular things like portable tablets and phones, means that we're getting exposed to blue light during part of the day when those retinal ganglion cells should not be activating, and yet they are activating. We know now that exposure to light from, for example, tablets and mobile phones late in the evening actually suppresses the body's production of melatonin and reduces the quality of sleep, and almost certainly is affecting our health negatively. So at the moment, for example, about 30% of adults in the USA don't get less than 6 hours sleep a night. That used to be 3% in 1960 when I was born. We're not suggesting that this change is entirely due to light, because there are other things like changing work patterns, people commuting longer distances, etc., which are changing the way we work and the way we live. But we believe that light is a major component of this problem, that we're just simply not getting enough sleep. So there's a paper here in Proceedings with the National Academy of Sciences 2015 saying evening exposure to a light-emitting display phase delays the circadian clock and acutely suppresses melatonin, which is a very, very bad thing. So you can see already that there's another route to the way in which light affects us, which is not psychological. You could perhaps argue it's physiological. Come more to that later. So I first became interested in this topic about about 8-9 years ago with this article, where they installed blue lights at 29 Yamanote stations in Tokyo to reduce suicides, and suicides fell by 70%. It's an extremely controversial topic. On the back of this, Gatwick's installed blue lights on the train platforms to prevent suicides and antisocial behaviour. And there's a railway crossing in Stirling in Scotland where people occasionally commit suicide, and they've installed blue lights there to prevent suicides. To be honest, I'm not at all convinced that blue lights on their own can prevent suicides. It's a very, very controversial topic, but it got me thinking about what light can and can't do. If you want a balanced view about this story, I would point you towards this article on the BBC website, Can Blue Lights Prevent Suicide at Train Stations? But it's just how I started thinking about this. What we do know, however, is that bright light therapy, for example, is a very, very effective treatment for seasonal affective disorder, or SAD. Seasonal affective disorder is a depression which mainly occurs in winter, and it's been known for many, many decades that it's caused by insufficient light in the morning. So it mainly affects people in the Northern Hemisphere during winter. And people were using these bright light therapy treatments to treat SAD long before we even knew about these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells and their role on the circadian system. But of course, now all the pieces fall together. We're simply, as a society, often getting insufficient light in the morning and too much light at night than is good for our health. And in one particular study, for example, they report that bright light therapy is about as effective as antidepressant drugs, which is a very, very good thing. So with that, I want to now just go through very quickly just 2 or 3 slides of each of 4 or 5 research projects I've been involved in. Before that, I just show you our lab. This is our spectral lighting lab. So it's a lab where we can change the color of the whole room. But it's not just based on sort of red, green, blue colored components, as you might find at Tesco, for example, or Philips. This is spectral lighting. We can control the spectral power distribution of the lighting in the room. And the first project I want to talk about is one that's actually taking place now. This is Meng-Wan Chen, who is a PhD student here with me. We're interested in the effect of morning exposure to light on healthy adults. So we know that morning exposure to light is beneficial for people with seasonal affective disorder. But what about the rest of us? Is it possible that we could all benefit from a bit more light during the morning? So she's been conducting a study in our lighting lab, and she used 4 different color temperatures of light: warm light on the left-hand side, 2,500 Kelvin, cool light, 18,000 Kelvin on the right-hand side. And basically, we expose people in the morning for 15 minutes to a light at 3,500 Kelvin as a conditioning light. Then we expose them for the next 45 minutes to one of these 4 lights. And we measured various things. We measured tympanic temperature, which is ear temperature. We measured PANAS, which is a psychological questionnaire to evaluate your emotion. We measured also KSS, which is a questionnaire which measures how alert or sleepy you're feeling. And I'll be talking about these things, especially PANAS and KSS, right throughout the whole presentation. First of all, the effect of color temperature on sleepiness. So you can see here changes in sleepiness scale. So higher values on the y-axis mean more sleepy. So this is relative to the 3,500 Kelvin light condition, when we introduced the test light condition, what happened to sleepiness? You can see that under 2,500 Kelvin, it went up, and here it went down. So 8,500 Kelvin seems to be about optimal. It gives you the maximum alertness. And on the right-hand side, you can see two aspects of the PANAS questionnaire. As again, the same thing changes compared to the 3,500 Kelvin condition. We're looking here on the left at positive emotions. So you can see that your positive emotions have increased with the cool light and decreased with the warm lights. Negative emotions, well, decreasing a lot under 8,500. Basically, we can say that 8,500 Kelvin lighting has most beneficial effects in terms of both alertness and emotions. So Meng Wan's in only the first year or first year and a half of her PhD, so there's a long way to go yet. But we're starting to find some evidence that exposure to light in the morning might be beneficial for people, even if they don't have seasonal affective disorder. It could make us all feel a lot better about life. And one thing that interests me is the application to things like care homes, especially for older people. So one of the problems, especially in the winter, in the Northern Hemisphere, it's too cold to get outside. It's too dark anyway. And one worry I have is that care homes like this one are simply not providing enough light during the morning especially. And the thing is, with modern LED light, we have the flexibility of the light dynamically during the day. And what should be happening is, in these places, the light should be really bright in the morning, simulating waking up on a sunny day. And then during the day, the light should gradually become less and less intense. And also a little bit warmer. The first project I did on lighting was with Sujin Lee, who did this project. Then she did a PhD with me, you'll see later, and now she's a postdoc. But her first project during her master's work, we wanted to see whether coloured lighting actually affects heart rate and blood pressure. And when we started looking at this, a lot of people said, well, why are you doing that? We said, well, what do you mean? They said, well, everybody knows that red light makes the heart beat faster. And you can find that, of course, splattered all over the internet. But when you do an actual literature search, there's a PhD thesis in 1950 in California that allegedly has some evidence. And there's a study in 1974 with some children in a hospital that maybe has some evidence. That's about it. Everybody just assumes it's true. Is it true? So we basically, this is before we had our really fancy lighting system. So we made this personal colour environment out of essentially a tent, which you can see that we backlit to create a red or green or a blue environment. We basically put people into a neutral coloured tent for 20 minutes to acclimatise. At the end of that time, we measured their mood using PANAS again. We also measured their blood pressure, their heart rate, and we measured it in 20 minutes time. So some experiments in this area are slightly flawed. So for example, you could take some people and put them in a red light or a green light, but they might have, some people might have naturally a higher resting heart rate than others. So what we wanted to do here was basically say for a person, what's the change of this light on that person? And was the change for red light different from the change with green or blue light, for example? And here's her results. So you've got the three lights, red, green and blue. It's change again relative to the neutral light. The white bar here shows you heart rate. So you can see that there was an increase of heart rate in the red light, exactly as everyone says on the internet, and a decrease of heart rate for the green and the blue light conditions. There was also, if you look at the grey bars, one is systolic and one is diastolic blood pressure. There was an increase in blood pressure on average under the red light condition, and some evidence of a decrease in blue and green conditions, a little bit more complicated. We published this in Tokyo in 2015, AIC. The problem is, oh, I've missed it out. The problem is none of these data are statistically significant. Look at the error bars, they're huge. These are the standard errors of the means. Also notice for heartbeat, it's going up by less than 0.5 of a beat per minute. So if red light does make the heartbeat faster, it's probably not by very much. And it's hard to measure because the whole situation is very noisy. We basically did a power calculation and it turned out that to be sure that there's no effect, we would need to have 200 people. So I was really keen to repeat this experiment with 200 people and produce the definitive experiment to really say whether red light does or doesn't make the heartbeat faster. Sujin wasn't very keen on that experiment. It was very, very dull. So she did something far more exciting, which I'll talk about in a second. But meanwhile, there's been another paper published in Colour Research and Application 2016. They've also got some data which are very, very similar to these data you can see here. But when I look at the recent literature and the various work we've done, yeah, I think it's probably true that red light does make the heartbeat faster and does increase blood pressure, but not by much, and it's very noisy, and this experiment simply doesn't have the statistical significance, unfortunately. However, she also measured PANAS, and there she did find statistical significance. So this is changes in using PANAS. You can say, are people feeling more nervous, more hostile, more distressed? And I should say that we don't simply say to people, are you feeling more nervous? That would be quite a problematic experiment, I think. PANAS asks the participants lots and lots of questions, and based on their responses, it is possible to derive a correlate of whether they're feeling nervous or hostile or distressed. And you can see that the red light condition did in fact make people feel more nervous, more hostile, more distressed, and more angry than the other lighting conditions. I mentioned that blue light in particular in the evening is thought to be problematic. However, what about the dose? In other words, if you just look at your phone for 5 seconds to check a text message, is that going to keep you awake? Or do you need to look at your phone for half an hour? And does it make a difference if you have your phone on its brightest setting or not? There's just no answer to these questions. So Jing Lin was another PhD student who's finished now, and she did her research on the effect of light exposure at night on alertness. So whereas Meng Wan did all her experiments at 9 o'clock in the morning, Jing did all of her experiments at 9 o'clock at night. And we used 3 lighting conditions, blue light. We specifically made them at 480 nanometers because that is the wavelength where the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells are sensitive to. We had 40 lux, 80 lux, 160 lux light. This is a picture of me, I think, in the lighting lab. And this thing on my head is a device we have for measuring directly how the brain is responding. So basically, we had people, some people were just in the dim condition. Each person would do each one, the dim condition for like an hour. Then you'd come back the next night and you do one of the others, the dim condition for 20 minutes, and then this 160 lux for 40 minutes. And you can see there are 4 conditions in total that each participant had to do. We measured brain response continually throughout the experiment. We measured the sleepiness scale at 3 points in the experiment. This shows you the results of the brain analysis. So when you look at brain response, you can look at particular locations in the brain, but for our work, it's more interesting to look at various frequencies that exist in the responses, and some particular frequencies called beta waves are associated with increased alertness. So if your brain is producing more beta waves, you're more alert. If it's producing less beta waves, you're less alert. You can see that the dim condition here is that's the control, and that's the relative power of beta waves. So you can see that going to 40 lux has an increase in alertness, 80 lux, a further increase in alertness, 160 lux, a very large increase in alertness. So some increase in alertness even at 40 lux, but not necessarily statistically significant. We only had 8 people. We measured also sleepiness. So higher sleepiness scores on the y-axis towards the top. The lower the KSS score, the more alert, the less sleepy you are. So you can see compared to the control condition, 40 lux, 80 lux, and 160 lux, meaning you're getting more and more alert. This star here and also the start here indicate comparisons which are statistically significant. So even with 8 participants, 160 lux light is making people feel more alert than dim light. But we also did the experiment again, and this time we did it with red light. And the reason for that is that although there's a very simple story that the rods and cones send their signals to the back of the brain and are concerned with vision, and the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells send their signals to the middle of the brain and are controlling things like body temperature and alertness and hormone secretion. It's thought to be not as simple as that. It's thought, for example, that some of the cones might actually also send their response indirectly to the hypothalamus. So we also wanted to see what effect would red light have at 9 o'clock in the evening. See the results on these 2 graphs. So I just added these on. So the first 4 bars are the dim and then the 3 blue light conditions. And you can see the red light condition here at 40 lux and 160 lux. Basically, almost producing as large an increase in beta waves as the blue light. And in fact, the 40 lux red light is producing a much larger response than the 40 lux blue light. When it comes to sleepiness or alertness, you can see that the red light condition at 40 lux and the red light condition at 160 lux having just as much effect of increasing alertness as the blue light. So it's really not as simple to say that it's all about blue light. There are lots of other studies, I've said, which suggest that the cones might actually contribute to the regulation of our circadian system as well. But one thing I'd like to suggest is there may be more than one thing going on at once here. There could be, let's call it a physiological effect through the hypothalamus and the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. But perhaps there's also a psychological effect. Perhaps, for example, we're becoming more alert, or we're feeling subjectively more alert because we're influenced by our association of the color red with energy. And this is one of the first clues that actually one of the reasons that often, if you look at studies about colour in this area, you get very contradictory results. It's because I believe there are multiple mechanisms, there are multiple things going on, which means that it's, unless you really carefully control experiments, it's not always possible to compare two experiments which might, on the face of it, look as if they're similar. So this is a slightly different topic. Guobin Jia has just passed his PhD last Friday, actually, and he's been looking at the effect of coloured light, in this case screens, on reaction time and concentration. And in fact, he's the second person to do this topic. We had an Eating, Duan also worked in this area before him, and also found a very significant effect. So in this case, he had people undergo a test of cognitive ability, for example, with a different coloured screen. And here are some of his results. So different coloured screens, reference white, yellow, green, blue, purple, red, orange. How quickly did people respond? So the further down the y-axis we are, the quicker response we have. So you can see that actually the green screen gave people responded most quickly on the green screen. But what about accuracy? So accuracy, the error rate is on the y-axis. So the smaller the error rate, the more accurate. So the green screen was actually the fastest and the most accurate. And these are standard errors of the mean, and it's highly significant, the differences. And Eating also found very strongly statistically significant effects of screen colour on performance on tasks like this. So this is just one way of looking at Guobin's results. So we're plotting here error rate on the x-axis, high error rate over here, low error rate over here, and then we're plotting response time, a quick response time over here, slow response time over here. So you could have this red light, for example, where people respond a little bit quicker than the neutral colour, but actually make a lot of errors. That means they've got high impulsivity. They respond fast, but with lots of errors. What we really want is to be in this segment where they're actually responding quicker and with fewer errors. We call that high arousal. And it seems that the green light is the best for that. The worst light is the purple light, which is very low arousal. So arousal, there's a line, if you can see my mouse, going along here, and impulsivity is a line sort of going this way. Later in his PhD, Guobin became interested in whether the results we get generally in our lab, you would also get in a virtual environment. And you can see a picture of our lab there with 3 lighting conditions. He looked at neutral, red and blue, and he's going to measure brain response, as we've done before in many studies. He's going to measure emotional response, which is PANAS, and also he had this 5-point smiley face response, you'll see in a second. But he also made, using 3ds Max software, a virtual representation of the labs. So that's the real lab, this is the virtual representation. So people were basically put into the rooms in real life and also virtually. And they were asked, for example, in this one case, using the smiley face scheme, to say whether they feel excited or depressed. And you can see, for example, PE means physical environment. So red makes people feel more anxious, white is natural, blue makes people feel more relaxed. You get the same sort of pattern in the virtual environment. So the evidence he's got so far is that actually you do get you do get the same effects in a virtual environment. And in fact, looking at several studies, I think you might actually get even stronger effects in the virtual environment than you do in the physical environment, which is quite interesting. He's also done some work on the PANAS results. So you can see it's slightly confusing, but again, you've got white, red, blue, and the first 6 bars are the physical environment, and then the next 6 are the virtual environment. And then the first 3 here are positive emotions, negative emotions. So you can see that the red has stronger positive emotions, but also stronger negative emotions than the blue. In the physical environment, exactly the same in the virtual environment. So a very, very similar pattern in the physical and virtual environments. So we started with Sujin, and we're back with Sujin. This was her PhD. She looked at, she was interested in the effective evaluation of coloured environments, particularly in an office scenario. So she had these like small office cubicles where people could be sitting having a work conversation constructed, and she looked at these 12 coloured lighting environments, and we were particularly interested in actually individual differences between people rather than average results. But I'm only going to show you the average results today because honestly, if I showed you the individual results, I'd be here for like an hour and a half just on that itself. But I'm going to show you the average results. So the first of all, which of those environments do you think you'd feel most comfortable in if that was a work environment? Well, here are the results. Slightly confusing graphs. The y-axis is always the same as the colours: red, orange, yellow, green, yellow, green, so on and so forth, all the way to purple. And then we've got various things, for example, inspiring or uninspiring. So which coloured light did people feel most inspired in? Yellow. Which one did they feel most unrestricted in? Yellow. Which one did they feel most comfortable in? Yellow. Most pleasant? Yellow. Most attractive? Yellow. Most preferred? Yellow. Though in terms of this one, which is personal, impersonal, it wasn't yellow, but you can see that actually yellow came out really strongly as a preferred lighting environment for office environments. And to be honest, when I first saw this, I was a little bit skeptical. I'm always skeptical about results, and I'm not. Would people really like yellow? Is that really a good colour? Well, her data are quite convincing. But I'll say more about that in a second, because my last project I'm going to talk about is OW. So one of the things that OW and I are interested in is the effect of colour to make inhospitable environments more hospitable. So this could be a submarine, it could be a polar scientific station, anywhere where you have limited space. And in this particular case, he's done some work on the basically the toilet area of a space station, which is a very, very restricted, somewhat inhospitable space. And my view, by the way, of all of this, and people who spoke to me about this and said, what could we do to make space travel more bearable using colour? My answer would be the biggest thing you could do is give people a choice, give people the ability to change the colour of their environment, so they could change it depending on their mood or to do different tasks, for example. And that's possible, of course, again, using the flexibility of LED lighting. Just, it's not about painting the space station a particular colour. It's about using LED lighting to allow flexibility and control. But nevertheless, if people were to have a fixed colour, which of these would be the best? So I was done a whole load of studies, and because of COVID, he actually couldn't do these studies in our lab most of the time. He did most of them actually in China at the Chinese Space Agency. But he measured heart rate, skin conductivity, subjective comfort, a whole lot of other things. Here are his results. So on the left, we've got the lighting: natural, yellow, red, orange, green, blue. Heart rate. So which one made people relax the most? Which one had the lowest heart rate? Yellow. Which one had the highest subjective comfort? Yellow, right? Honestly, it's very, very similar to Sujin's results. So I think there's something in this here that actually yellow lighting might be quite preferred by people, even though, curiously, if you ask people what their favorite color is, generally, and then ask them what their least favorite color is, as you might know, most people respond their favorite color is blue, and most people, if asked for their least favorite color, would respond yellow. But that's quite a different question to what colored lighting in an environment will make you feel most comfortable or have the most beneficial effect on your heart rate. So we're getting to the end now, and timing's not too bad, I think. What time is it? 12:46, not too bad. So is blue a relaxing colour, or is it a stimulating colour? And I ask this question because before I get to the point, I should say that I addressed this question in more detail in a white paper that Sujin and I wrote in conjunction with the interior design brand Harlequin. They don't pay me to say this, but honestly, they produce the most gorgeous interior design patterns. But in this paper, which you can download here, we put forward this idea that there are at least two, but we've identified two mechanisms going forward, which I've hinted at. One which in the white paper they refer to as an emotional response, and one which they refer to in the white paper as a physical response. I still slightly prefer psychological for the emotional one and physiological on the right-hand side. So psychological, remember I started talking about the colour blue and whether that picture of the sea is relaxing. This is what I'm talking about. Its mechanism is associative, based on memory, based on experience, and is learned. On the other hand, this physiological response, which is probably primarily driven by the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, the non-visual pathway, the hypothalamus, it's involuntary, it's subconscious, it's innate, it was born with it. So the left-hand one is primarily driven by our rods and cones. The right-hand one is primarily driven by our intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, though note the caveat I said before about that story not being quite so simple. This is why I say primarily. Because we have different life experiences, and because this mechanism is based on memory and experience, responses may be individualized. And that's indeed exactly what Sujin found in her PhD work. On the other hand, the non-visual pathway, because it's involuntary, subconscious, innate, responses are much more likely to be consistent between individuals. And here's the thing, the effects of these two mechanisms may well be contradictory. I can't help but be reminded of Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. I think he won the Nobel Prize for some of these ideas. So if you've read this, it's a very interesting book. It's not about colour, it's about thinking. But he basically says that there are two systems. You can conceptually consider two systems in our thought processes. System one operates automatically and quickly with little or no effort, no sense of voluntary control. You basically make your mind about things very quickly, right? But the other one requires attention. It's a slower process. It's a more complex process. It's often more subjective. Choice comes in there. I can't help but make the comparison between these two, that this is the one on the right is the fast system and the one on the left is the slow system. That may be going too far, I don't know. So why might we say that, why might we ask a question about whether blue light is relaxing or not? Well, remember I said lots of studies have shown that blue light from emissive devices at night may trigger the non-image forming, intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. I hope someone's counting how many times I say that, and result in increased alertness. This is bad for sleep. So why should we recommend use of blue in the bedroom? It's a totally different thing. The light intensity from the reflective walls in a bedroom, unless you have incredibly industrial standard lighting in your room, the light intensity reflected from your blue walls is unlikely to be anywhere near bright enough to activate this intrinsic photosensitive non-visual pathway. However, what it does activate is you see the color blue, and that's activating your psychological response. And our psychological response to blue, as I demonstrated at the very beginning or suggested at the very beginning of the presentation, is often relaxing. So when people say, is blue relaxing? You can't really ask that question unless you talk about blue what? Intense blue light emitted from a device 2 inches from your face is probably alerting. Blue in a bedroom with subtle lighting conditions is probably relaxing, and that's the sort of tension I see in these two systems. The bottom line of all this, I think, is that there's a lot more we can do to utilize the flexibility of modern LED lighting, which, as I've mentioned, allows us to change the color and the intensity of the lighting throughout the day, depending upon what we're doing and depending upon our personal circumstances, to optimize our well-being and performance. This is just showing you our lighting system. Thank you very much for listening, and particular thanks to our sponsor, VeriVide, with whom we've had a very long-standing and fruitful collaboration. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks, Steve.
Okay.
If anyone's got any questions, if they want to pop them in the chat now. There is a question on there, Steve, from Sue Bolton.
Well, I know Sue very well. She always asks a question, and actually that is an excellent question. So I'm going to address that one straight away, because I couldn't agree with you more, Sue. When Edison invented the light bulb, although I know you will say that he didn't actually invent it, but he was one of the inventors, or at the early stages of it, he actually wrote, electric light in no way interferes with our natural sleep. because there was a lot of concern around that point that there might be a problem. And he convinced people there wouldn't be a problem. And actually, he was right, you know, because the good thing about tungsten light is it was mainly warm and not very bright, and certainly wasn't activating the intrinsic photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. I don't necessarily think it's a good thing that I see people with these really cold, I'm talking about high color temperature lighting, especially in their bathrooms, in their kitchen, an exposure to this sort of light later in the evening, although it's become very trendy, it may well actually be not helpful to people's sleep. And I should say that when we talk about sleep, it's one thing to have your sleep disrupted and actually wake up and be aware that you're not sleeping well. But you can also feel as if you're asleep the whole time, but be not getting sufficient quality sleep, what we call deep sort of REM sleep, which is where a lot of good things happen in terms of the body. So yeah, so totally. I think there's a concern over lighting in the home, which is too high temperature, color temperature. The answer, of course, is to have LED lighting. So when you wake up, the lighting is really bright and really blue, which gets you going. All the benefits of that first study I showed you with Mengwan. But then during the day, the lighting should automatically become warmer and less intense. And by the evening, you really should be just living in warm lighting, which is what we would have done with candlelight and firelight before the invention of electric lights. So I'm going to ask, if I don't mind, there could be some stuff on the Q&A, but there's a question from Freya, who I also know and very much respect her work. It's very interesting. And she's asking about colour contrast. That's a very good point. So one of the issues that could occur, especially with the experiment where people are reading text on a screen, is that it might not be effective colour. It might be just the effect of contrast. So it's a good question, Freya. And obviously, we do have to control the contrast. So we make sure that the actual luminance contrast, at least, is consistent between the different colour conditions. You're totally right about that. Matthew, another person I know very well and respect. Yeah, is there any cross-cultural effects? And that's a good question, Matthew. Cultural effects. I think there probably are, but I'm going to take a little bit of time to think about that. I might get back to you about it and drop you an email about it. But I think, yeah, I think there are some cultural effects. There certainly are cultural effects when it comes to colour meanings. So the most obvious one to cite would be the idea that red is a lucky colour. So we've done lots of work, which is a different topic altogether, on colour meanings. And if you go to Asia, for example, you find that red is strongly associated with good luck and good fortune. And of course, there's lots of cultural and historical reasons why that should be. People getting little red envelopes with money and things for their birthday and things like that. Is red a lucky colour in the UK? No, not at all. And especially not for me, because I'm a fan of Manchester United. But even generally, I don't think it's a lucky colour. I'd say if any colour was associated with good luck in the UK, I would say green, and that's because we associate it with the luck of the Irish. So we've actually done studies on this where we've asked people to tell us what different colours mean. And we find that if you compare, for example, English and Chinese, then you would find that, broadly speaking, we're more similar than different. we're much more similar. So most of the associations are similar, but there are some huge differences. So I've already mentioned the one about red. There's also the one about death. So black is a colour associated with death in our country, but in some other countries, as some of you may know, it's like white or even red. So going back to this presentation, because I've talked about these two pathways, then you might expect we have the same underlying physiology. So that physiological system, the effect of the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, I would expect there to be no difference in culture between that. But the other system, which is based on our experiences, our associations, I've already hinted at that because of the meanings of colours that we've looked at. Yeah, you would expect there to be some cultural differences. I think in the end, Matthew, I got around to it and answered your question appropriately. Hope so anyway. Right, I'm looking at the other questions now. So let's have a look. Yeah, good comment by Sally. Thank you for thanking me, Sue. Thanks, Alexandre. Yeah, fluorescent lighting is very depressing, though blue. From Ramona. There used to be, well, fluorescent lighting can be problematic, and the reason for that is the flicker. The flicker of the light can be unsettling, can give people headaches, and I believe it's got better. But in fact, I think by 2025, they're outlawing the production of fluorescent tubing lighting in the same way that they've outlawed in Europe tungsten bulbs. So it won't be a problem much longer, Ramona. And with LED lighting, you don't get that flicker. It's a totally different technology. And Mark from Sri Lanka has noted particular associations of orange with Buddhism. So again, going back to that psychological mechanism, yes, you would expect to see some cultural differences there. Yeah, Jonathan, I don't know who that is because I can't see their last name, but I think he's asking the question that actually interests Sujin and I, and Sujin I know is here today, but probably can't speak. The question about individual differences and what is common to all of us, and I think when it comes to these this psychological mechanism, I would say that we all share approximately the same culture. We all live in the same environment, but with differences, which is why I think, broadly speaking, we're more similar than different. So, for example, most people actually do find blue psychologically relaxing. I don't. I hate blue. I hate buying things which are blue. And I really like yellow and pink. So there are some individual differences, but broadly speaking, if you look, irrespective of gender or culture, once you get to adulthood, it's different for children. If you ask people their favourite colour, most people say blue. So I think there's more similarities than differences, but there are some important differences. Just as there are more similarities, for example, in Chinese and British colour meanings than there are differences, but those differences are really important to know about. I think, Hannah, that might be as much.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I think we've got most of the questions there, but we can always, if there's any any that come through that we don't have time to answer now, I can send across to you, Steve, and we can answer them in the chat, and people will still be able to receive them after we've come offline.
I'm only glad I kept approximately well to time, didn't I? Not too bad.
Not too bad. 4 minutes, so we'll let you off for that. But yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for coming, everyone, and hope you found it useful. Feel free to email me and follow up with any questions. I'm just typing my email into the chat. I did type it wrong though, so I'll do it again. I can't even spell my own name. There we are, s.westland@leeds.ac.uk. Email me if you have any comments or anything else at all. So thank you very much.